this is the neglected tropical disease session. For those of you that don't know what the neglected tropical diseases are, they're everything but TB, HIV, and malaria. Steve, did you hear me? Not malaria, not yet. In fact, there are a bunch of 21 communicable diseases, including viruses, bacteria, worms, and the topic of our first talk, which is snakebite. And we've got Professor Nick Casewell, who's worked his way up from being an undergraduate on our tropical disease biology course through to becoming head of the Department of Tropical Disease Biology and now head of the Centre for Snakebite Research and Interventions. So, Nick.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'm going to talk to you today about snakebite as a neglected tropical disease, and in particular some of the research that we've been doing here at LSTM to try and improve therapeutics for people who suffer from tropical snakebite. So on screen here, particularly on the right-hand side, I just want to illustrate this photo that really encapsulates what snakebite is all about. It's a neglected tropical disease that mostly affects rural agricultural workers, particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And you can see some of the headline figures that are on screen here at the moment as well. We think perhaps as many as 138,000 people die from snakebite every single year. And many more people who survive the bite will also suffer from long-term morbidity as a result of the diverse toxic molecules that are found in snake venoms. And so these can be broadly characterized and categorized into different toxin families, and you can see those illustrated by these bars on screen. But the point here is this diversity of toxins that are in the venom. There may be upwards of 100 different proteins in any one snake venom, cause very different pathological effects in a snakebite patient, ranging from bleeding disturbances, coagulopathy, cytotoxicity at the bite site leading to tissue damage, all the way through to neurotoxic effects that can lead to muscle paralysis and respiratory failure. And ultimately, what we face with snakebite is this really heterogeneous mix where any particular snake venom will have its own unique cocktail of these toxins. And when you compare one snake to the next, you see great diversity. This causes a real challenge when we're trying to develop broadly effective therapeutics, because we have a lot of different molecules that we think we have to neutralize to have a therapy that's going to be effective across a broad region of the world. So at the moment, we use treatments known as antivenoms. These are polyclonal antibody-based therapeutics that we make by hyperimmunizing animals and then harvesting the antibodies from their plasma. These serotherapies are without doubt life-saving treatments, and they're the only specific treatments that we have for snakebite today. But they come with a huge number of limitations associated with them, and you can see several of those on screen. This issue of venom variation between different medically important snakes causes us a real problem in that we have to have different antivenoms for treating bites in different parts of the world. We have issues with the safety of these products because when we're injecting patients with foreign protein, these animal antibodies, you have a high incidence of adverse reactions. We also have to manage those adverse reactions in a clinical environment, and this means that patients will have to go from those rural isolated settings into a clinical environment, typically a hospital, to receive antivenom so that we can manage that risk of adverse reaction and deliver those drugs intravenously. And that's a real issue for snakebite because it's an acute life-threatening event, and that time from bite to treatment is really critical for patient outcomes. We also have other challenges, including affordability. Antivenoms are very expensive therapeutics in the settings with which they're used. And we have this fragmented drug market as the result of needing different products to treat different types of snakebite all across the world. And we also have weak regulatory frameworks that are kind of guiding the quality of products available. And we often see inappropriate antivenoms being used in one region where really they shouldn't be. So there's a real strong motivator to try and improve treatment for snakebite, and there's lots of research going on in this space, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, where people are employing new approaches to discover new molecules that may be beneficial for targeting the toxins that are causing pathology in snakebite. And you can see a list of them on screen here. But I think the point really that I want to highlight here is that we might need different molecules to inhibit different types of venom toxins. And more broadly, because of this issue with venom variation and this different composition of venom toxins found across snakes, we're likely to need combinations of these therapeutic molecules ultimately to deliver broad, effective cures for large regions of the world. So we've been working quite extensively in the space of toxin-inhibiting drugs, so small molecules as an alternative approach for snakebite therapy compared to those polyclonal antibodies we're using at the moment. And this strategy appears quite useful for certain types of toxins, particularly those that are enzymes. And so enzymes like phospholipases, metalloproteinases, serine proteases are all found in snake venoms, and are also associated with other human diseases as well. And so there's been a lot of drug discovery work that's gone into this space over many years for other conditions. And this provides us with a really nice opportunity to take a drug repurposing approach to see whether we can utilize any of those previously discovered molecules that have gone through into safety testing and onwards and repurpose them for a snakebite indication. And these enzymes have a shared catalytic site, which makes this amenable to targeting with some of these molecules and trying to give us that broad inhibitory spectrum of a single drug inhibiting a whole class of toxins, unlike the strategy we have at the moment. But I think the most kind of rational reason to employ a drug targeting strategy is also that of the oral bioavailability of these molecules. So many drugs are available to be used in an oral route of administration, and there's a clear opportunity there to try and intervene much sooner after a snakebite by delivering oral drugs to patients before perhaps they need to go on to hospital and still receive antivenom secondarily. So I'm going to take you through one piece of work that we've been doing really targeting an important toxin family called the metalloproteinases. These are really abundant toxins found in lots of different vipers, and they're responsible for causing really potent hemotoxic effects, including bleeding disturbances and coagulopathy. The metalloproteinases rely on zinc for their mechanism of action, and so we've been using metal chelators as a potential strategy to ultimately inactivate these metalloproteinases by chelating the zinc that's required for their mechanism of action. And most importantly, many metal chelators are already licensed drugs, so these medicines are already being used clinically for the treatment of heavy metal poisoning. And for an NTD like snakebite, that's really important because it provides us with a route to look at how we can repurpose an existing medication and move it through into clinical development at relatively low costs compared to the development of a completely new type of drug. So after a variety of different research that we did in the laboratory environment using in vitro models, we came upon our lead candidate, which is a metal chelating drug called DMPS, sometimes referred to as unithiol. And we were able to show that this single metal chelator was able to prevent systemic envenoming caused by this really medically important snake found in West Africa, the saw-scale viper. To do so, we used a small animal preclinical model where we challenge animals with venom or venom mixed with the metal chelator, and we're able to demonstrate that this single molecule can protect those mice in this pre-incubation model where we're co-injecting the therapy with the venom for a period of time. And so this is kind of a shift in paradigm compared to using these diverse mixtures of lots of different polyclonal antibodies that are direct against lots of different toxins that we're currently using with antivenom. Here we've just got a single molecule that we've directed towards a really important toxin family that is able to prevent the lethal effects of a really medically important snake venom. And this work was led by Laura Albalescu in our lab here at CSRI in LSTM. But of course, this kind of co-injection model isn't very reflective of real-world snakebite. So we've also been able to demonstrate using rescue models where we will inject the drug after the venom challenge, that again, you have a window of protection here from the lethal effects of the venom for a period of about 8 hours. This drug is able to, again, protect these animals from the toxicity of the venom. And you can see there's a secondary drop-off here with the blue lines, probably due to clearance of the drug as we go longer into that experimental time course. But when we combine the drug with antivenom secondarily, which is how we envisage these drugs potentially being used, you can see that we can improve that protection. So here, the animals are getting early drug, followed by later intravenous antivenom. And that also extends through to an oral model where we're dosing these animals orally with the drug. So partial protection with the drug, partial protection with late antivenom, mimicking what happens right now. But when we combine these two things together, we can provide complete protection against both the lethal and the local effects of this venom. And that's really important because that's ultimately how we envisage these drugs working in the real world down the line. So a patient who's bitten by a snake can receive an oral drug rapidly after that snake bite and then move on to hospital secondarily and receive antivenom thereafter to mop up any remaining toxicity. And that should dramatically reduce that time to treatment that's critical for good patient outcomes. And so what we've tried to do with DMPS is move it forward into clinical development in a study led by Mike Abianis here at LSTM and in partnership with Manga Hamaluba's team at Kemry Wellcome and also Sekou at the University of Liverpool. We undertook a phase 1 dose escalation study with DMPS. And so what we did here was to try and escalate the dose of this already licensed medication to a much higher dose that we think will be more suitable for snake bite compared to heavy metal poisoning. People who receive this drug for heavy metal poisoning will receive multiple doses a day, often for many weeks, for a more chronic condition, whereas snake bite is really an acute event. And we think we need higher drug levels early on for this drug to be effective. So we moved through an escalating approach where we went from the standard 300 milligram dose of this drug all the way through to 1500 milligrams in several different steps. And we saw reassuring safety from that study with no severe adverse events. And when we analysed the drug levels in the patients who received the drug, we were able to show that the 1500, our highest dose, gave us drug levels that were comparable to an intravenous dose. And so that was really reassuring, particularly since those peak drug levels are happening within around 3 hours, which is well within that window where patients still wouldn't be in hospital. Since then, we've been able to optimize a multiple dosing regimen where we're giving 3 doses of the drug over a 24-hour period, and again show that that's well tolerated and it gives us nice drug levels that are consistent for a 48-hour period at a higher level than you would get with the standard dose of the drug at the moment. And so we think that this will give us now an optimized regimen that we can use in a phase 2 clinical study to evaluate the efficacy of the drug for snakebite. And we recently received some funding from Open Philanthropy to perform such a study. So for the next few years, we are going to be developing a phase 2 clinical trial in both South America and West Africa to evaluate how well this drug will work, with the goal to randomize patients in the community prior to them attending hospital. They'll receive the oral drug. Everyone will then go on to hospital and receive antivenom. And we hope to evaluate whether we see an efficacy signal by measuring coagulopathy or the prevention of coagulopathy by the drug. And so hopefully this provides you an example of how we've gone from the bench all the way through to clinical development for an NTD. And we hope that in the future, this drug or others may give us a completely new type of therapeutic format for treating snakebite. And so I'll finish there. Lots of people to thank, particularly those from the Centre for Snakebite Research and Interventions and many collaborators from all over the world, as well as the funders who have supported this research. Thank you.
I'm afraid because of the delay in starting, we're going to have to do the same as the resistance session and see if we've got any time at the end for questions. So we move on now to our second presentation, and we're going to move into vector control, which is an area which has been neglected as part of the strategies used for neglected tropical diseases. But Andrew Hope has joined us in 2016, working with Professor Steve Torr, and since Steve's retirement, he has taken over as head of the Tiny Targets program, which is making some great strides in the control of tsetse flies. Andrew.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about the work that we've been doing in our group, working with tiny targets and the role that vector control with tiny targets is playing in efforts to eliminate Gambian sleeping sickness. Okay, so To start with some very quick basics, so don't mean to patronise if this is already very well known. But of course, trypanosomes are transmitted by tsetse flies. They're parasites which cause sleeping sickness in humans. There are two forms of the disease, Gambian hat and Rhodesian hat. Here on the right-hand side, we can see the evolution of sleeping sickness over the last 85 years with large numbers of cases in the 1940s and then efforts really to bring the case burden down between the 40s and 60s. And this came down to below 10,000 cases per year reported and sort of plateaued at this level for about 20 years or so before starting to pick up again in the 1980s. And then from the 1990s, we had some really big outbreaks again. The number of cases reported reached about 40,000 a year, but there was a huge amount of underreporting, and WHO estimate that there were probably up to 400,000 deaths per year during this epidemic. So I'm focusing on Gambian sleeping sickness. This is found to the west of the red line on the map here. Rhodesian sleeping sickness is found to the east, and thankfully they don't overlap geographically. So Gambian hat is Trypanosoma brucei gambiense. It's transmitted by riverine tsetse. It's a chronic disease. Someone can have it for months or even years before they notice any of the major signs and symptoms. Generally considered to be an anthropognosis maintained between humans and tsetse. And the Gambian form of sleeping sickness accounts for over 90% of all sleeping sickness cases. In terms of where most of the cases are found, so between 1990 and 2023, almost 70% of the cases were in DRC, with Angola and others representing fewer percentage of cases. So importantly for sleeping sickness, there is no vaccine, there are no prophylactic drugs available, and it is generally fatal if it's left untreated. So after those outbreaks in the 1990s, WHO led a concerted effort with national programs and partners to improve screening and treatment and bring down case numbers. And in 2012, with the London Declaration, they published a roadmap to eliminate sleeping sickness as a public health problem by 2020. With two global indicators. So the first, to bring down the number of cases to fewer than 2,000 cases annually, and then also to bring about a 90% reduction in the area considered to be at moderate or high risk. And then on top of that, specifically for Gambian sleeping sickness, so GHAT, a further goal of elimination of transmission by 2030. So a lot of effort has gone into increasing screening and treatment since the 1990s. DRC is the country with the highest disease burden, and they have been screening at a very high level for a long time now. So over 2 million people screened per year since the early 2000s, as represented by the blue line on the figure here. And as we can see, we've got a steady decline in the number of cases being reported in DRC over the last 25 years. But the question is, will this be enough to eliminate Gambian hat, relying on a screening and treatment strategy alone? So this is some work by our colleagues at HatMap, which is a consortium led by University of Warwick, looking at data from DRC and looking to see whether screening alone would be sufficient to eliminate transmission of Gambian sleeping sickness by 2030 across all of the endemic health zones of DRC. And the results show that if a health zone is in blue, then there's a high probability of achieving elimination of transmission by 2030. But many of them are, well, most of them are in red, indicating that there is a low probability of these health zones achieving elimination by 2030. So this is for screening alone. But when they rerun the model with the addition of vector control, we see a marked difference in the outcomes for 2030. With the addition of vector control into health zones, then the probability of elimination increases, and there's a high probability for all health zones to be able to achieve elimination. Not that this is a simple thing to do either, I must stress. So what about vector control? For Gambian hat, Traditionally, this wasn't done very much. Some countries would do some trapping, but it wasn't done particularly at scale. Whereas for Rhodesian hat transmitted by savanna species, a number of vector control tools had been developed and used at large scale and proved to be cost effective. But unfortunately for the riverine species that transmit G hat, these tools were not found to be cost effective. They were found to be very logistically challenging to implement in riverine areas. So we're not a practical solution to introduce vector control for Gambian hat. But you probably know where this is going, because you've probably heard this story a number of times before from me and others in the group, the tiny target story. So an international consortium of various research institutions, collaborators from across Europe and from sub-Saharan Africa, and also industry partners, looked at the host-seeking behaviour of riverine tsetse and looking specifically at the responses to different visual and olfactory cues. And that led to the development of tiny targets, seen here in situ in northwest Uganda. So these attract and kill tsetse, and compared to traps, they are twice as effective, much, much cheaper to use. They're longer lasting. The insecticide remains active for at least 6 months. And they're far easier to deploy in the riverine habitat that these tsetse inhabit. So here, early trials from West Nile focus in Uganda and also from the Mandul focus in Chad. So tiny targets are deployed along riverbanks and around lakes where you have riverine vegetation, where the riverine tsetse inhabit. So in West Nile, these were introduced in 2011 and then gradually scaled up. And what we saw with the trials here was that once tiny targets had been deployed in an area, within 6 months we had a reduction of about 80% in tsetse densities. In Chad, in the Mandul focus, the results are even more dramatic. After tiny targets have been introduced, we see a dramatic decline in tsetse. 99% reduction, and it's not because they didn't go looking for tsetse that we didn't find any. The stars here on the graph represent the different entomological surveys that were undertaken here. So we can see in both of these environments, tiny targets having a really strong impact on tsetse populations. And since those early trials, tiny targets have been scaled up and are deployed at large scale across 5 countries that account for almost 90% of all of the cases of the last decade. So we have a combined coverage of about 21,000 square kilometres of implementation, protecting over 2.5 million people from Gambian sleeping sickness. Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea and Uganda are part of the Trapano Consortium, and DRC is part of the Triple-M Consortium. And across both of these projects, vector control is implemented as part of an integrated approach with screening and treatment done at the same time. So, of course, we want to make sure that vector control is also impacting on the disease. So we go back to the example of the Mandul focus in Chad. So here we observed 99% reduction in tsetse abundance. And looking at the impact of this on disease, this is modelling work carried out by Mohammed et al., looking at the number of new infections each year between 2000 and 2013, and then estimating the number of new infections going forward with improved control techniques being used. And they predicted that with the addition of vector control, we would see a drop from 300 new cases per year to about 7 new cases per year. This analysis was then updated again in 2022 by Rock et al. And they confirmed the earlier findings and predictions, and also predicted that transmission in this focus was interrupted from 2015, and 74% of the reduction in transmission was attributed to vector control. So tiny targets routinely achieve a reduction in tsetse densities greater than 80% once they're introduced into an area. We've seen impact on the disease in Chad. In Uganda, we've done analyses. We've got analyses going on in DRC. We've got examples from Guinea as well. Tiny targets have been adopted as part of national policy in the countries where it's being used, and the WHO has now also adopted vector control as one of the key strategies for the roadmap. And we've seen elimination as a public health problem in 3 of the countries that tiny targets are used. So Côte d'Ivoire was the first to declare, followed by Uganda, and this year Chad also achieved this important milestone. On top of that, 2 of the countries are on track to achieve elimination of transmission next year, and we expect others will also follow. And in 2023, the number of cases reported globally was 675, so that was about a 90% reduction compared to 10 years ago. In addition to sort of game-changing vector control through tiny targets, there's also game-changing treatments coming for sleeping sickness. So historically, treatment would be quite complicated, requiring multiple days of intravenous administration of medication. We now have an oral drug that can be administered, fexinidazole, and there are trials ongoing for another new drug, acoziborole, which would be a single-dose oral drug, which would make a massive change to sleeping sickness treatment, particularly in rural settings where the health system is less advanced. So in terms of what's next, we need to continue to support the countries where we're already working so that they achieve elimination as a public health problem and then go on to achieve elimination of transmission. We've already expanded into some other geographies away from those 5 countries that I already mentioned. So as part of the Trapano Consortium, we've expanded into Angola, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Sierra Leone, and LSTM is directly involved for vector control support in Angola and South Sudan. But there are other areas that also require attention. In DRC, we're only working in a small area at the moment. We need to expand further. It's the country with the highest burden, so really needs intensified control measures there. But there are other countries such as Congo, Brazzaville, Cameroon, Gabon, which also need support. We can't get to elimination without supporting all of the countries to get across the line. Working with our partners for the future, we'll be looking at new strategies, thinking about the possibility of screen and treat, working on new strategies for reactive vector control, strategies for implementing vector control in even harder to reach places than where we currently work, and also working with our partners, thinking about detecting unknown foci and also how to handle re-emergence. So, is elimination of GHAT achievable? I think, we can be optimistic. We've got 2 countries that are approaching 5 years without any cases. We've got methods which are really effective. We know that they work. We've got the evidence that they work. We've got national control programs which have capacity to implement these programs. And then we've got this single-dose oral drug that's potentially on the horizon as well. Of course, we still have reasons to be cautious as well. The WHO goals are for 2030, which is only 6 years away. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of work to expand in DRC and also in some of the other countries that need support. We've got countries which have got ongoing insecurity and conflict. Already during the Trapano project, we've seen the results of that with issues in South Sudan leading to large-scale migration of refugees into northern Uganda. So that remains a problem. And we also need to think about post-elimination capacity and ensuring that there is capacity in place in those countries so that they can manage things in the future as well. And it's not once you get to elimination that everything sort of stops and we leave. But I think we can be optimistic. As I say, we've got the tools, we've got everything that we need. It's just a case of getting it everywhere where it needs to be, which I know is not simple. But I think, we're on the right track. So I finish to say thanks to the Tiny Targets team here at LSTM, past and present, who are all listed here. All of our partners, especially the national programs in the countries who are really at the forefront of implementation. Number of consultants who work for us, and of course our funders, particularly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you.
If that's not an impact case study, then I don't know what is. Very good. Congratulations. Our next speaker is Sian Freer. Sian joined the Centre for Neglected Tropical Diseases as Chief Operating Officer in 2013, building on the Lymphatic Support Centre and the CNTD implementation programme launched by David Molyneux. And so, unfortunately, Sian will be leaving us at the end of this year. So this is her swan song about the impact of the elimination programme for LF and other NTDs.
So I'm going to try and pack at least 10 years into 10 minutes, so it's going to be a struggle. But I'm going to focus on the implementation period. From the start, the theme is the glass half empty now or half full. So I'm taking us from the beginning of the implementation of the programme. And as Andrew mentioned as well, I'll just put the dates up there just for information. But as Andrew mentioned, the programme followed the 2012 London Declaration and NTDs, where DFID, UK Aid, DFID as was then, announced funding for individual disease programmes, and LSTM was successful in securing funding for the LF elimination programme. This was at a point of a transition in DFID as well, where they were starting to use business cases. We were, I think, pretty much the first programme that had such a business case. We weren't involved in that preparation. It was a consultant who had actually written it. So as anyone who has worked with UK Aid now, DFID or FCDO will know, it's really important to get your results framework right, because your funding, your ongoing funding from year to year, your continuation in a programme is purely dependent on your results. And therefore, with the LF elimination programme, we were supporting 12 project countries, 10 in Africa, plus Nepal and Bangladesh, to achieve these targets. So for various reasons, although it was awarded in 2012, we didn't actually start until 2013. And by then, the person who had written the business case was no longer at DFID, so we couldn't go back to ask why certain things were in there. So these are the targets that we had. And I would particularly draw your attention, it's in small print, sorry, but that we had some of the expectations that were in that document, that by 2016, so we're talking about 3 years here, that we would achieve elimination, or countries in at least 3 countries would achieve elimination by 2016 and global elimination by 2020. Now, bearing in mind that a mass drug administration for lymphatic filariasis takes a minimum of 5 years, you can see that it was very flawed from the very beginning. So trying to actually navigate our way through what the expectations were, trying to manage those, was particularly difficult at the start of the programme. So the realities were, as I say, going back to those targets. So one of our targets was 100 million people in 12 countries treated with preventive therapy. My first question was, well, what does people treated mean? And they didn't know. So for instance, in a country such as Mozambique, treating 15 million a year, the total of at-risk populations in the 12 countries did not amount to 100 million. In the end, we provided what we could do, what we could give them as a definition, and that was what we lived with, and that was what we reported. We had no definition for what a case averted was. They certainly couldn't give us any idea of where that had come from. And the 1.7 million disabilities and 700,000 DALIs averted. Again, no consensus, no agreement, no understanding of what that meant or what they expected from that. So we started pretty much in a state of confusion. So in terms of the gaps and challenges we faced, I mean, obviously the environmental challenges that you can see there, but for the baseline mapping, in some countries it wasn't available at all, the data wasn't there. We had countries that were classified as endemic for LF, but the original data wasn't available. We had a component and funding which was linked to morbidity, hydrocele and lymphedema. There was no burden, no case estimates, so that component of funding was delayed, mainly because we couldn't actually project what that would involve, that part of the programme. There were unreliable diagnostics. The antigen test at the time required, that was done for some of the mapping that was available, required a cold chain, and in the field it wasn't possible to have a cold chain, and when there was no cold chain you actually had false positives. So as we started the programme, it was apparent that there were districts that had been classed as endemic that they weren't. So the gaps and challenges were quite significant. Because this is a programme that is run out of the Central Ministry of Health. We always worked through the Central Ministry of Health, and they're often the NTD programme is often the orphan within the Ministry of Health. So their programme capacity, the programme officers that were in the Ministry of Health, they were sometimes relatively inexperienced, or they were experienced in a different field. So, and it was essential. You have to get the central ministry to be able to mobilise a programme that covers the whole country, right down to the district community level, to administer treatments depending how the country wanted to do it. I gave you the example of Mozambique. They did their MDA across about 15 million people in 1 week. So you had to find those people and you had to support those people in the national programme to be able to deliver this. So with a group of programme managers from Liverpool, every country had a dedicated programme manager who worked with the Central Ministry of Health team and then down to the province and the district levels. As you can imagine, with treating millions of people at one time, the medicines are all donated by the pharma companies, but the shipments, that all had to be managed. As soon as the drugs arrive in country and they clear the port of entry, they are the responsibility of the national programme. And these are people that are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have an expertise in supply chain or getting the drugs to the right areas. So the sort of support they needed was across the piece. And we very quickly found that in terms of monitoring and evaluation, there were very few protocols, non-existent, or there was no consensus. So, for instance, a coverage survey is a perfect example. So WHO protocol was that you would do a coverage survey of treatments. After you've done a treatment campaign, you would do a coverage survey, and that would be done once every 5 years, and that you would essentially have to go through into every district where you've provided the drugs to then verify that the coverage. But we were required to do annual coverage surveys to be able to verify. We needed to verify that the treatments had happened. So we had to develop our own protocol, our own LQA, the system we used, ODK and LQAS surveys, to do rapid, low-cost surveys that could be done by the ministry teams in the field, and that the data was all owned by the country, it was all held in the country, but we could see that data from Liverpool and could provide verification to DFID. As I said about morbidity care, that was not initially included, and we had to develop our own systems to actually do case finding. Countries had never done any case finding, they'd never been supported to do that. We needed to train community health workers to be able to detect cases. And then we also had teams that were used to a different programme, a community-directed treatment programme with ivermectin, which was very different to a mass drug administration. The CDTI system could span a considerable amount of time. MDAs have to happen in a very contained period in order to be verified. So we were taking groups of drug distributors away from what they were used to doing to a new system, and also there was no protocols, no guidance on any post-MDA surveillance. So just showing here the countries that on the left that we started with between 2009 to 2019. As I said, 10 countries in Africa, and then Bangladesh and Nepal. And then from 2019 to 2022, we moved to the Ascend programme, where LSTM were part of that. This was awarded in 2 lots by FCDO by then, and LSTM was part of Lot 2, which was West and Central Africa. And what you may be able to see there, but the critical thing for me that you see at the end, that I mentioned at the end, is that in that change, countries that we had been supporting for 10 years, we had to leave those and were moved on to other countries, which is relevant later. So I guess the part of filling the glass of actual improvements, there was a concerted effort, there was increased funding. We were working alongside colleagues from USAID. And in terms of the USAID programme, they worked in a very different way to us. They did develop their own parallel office, if you like, in countries, whereas we always worked through the Central Ministry of Health. So we developed those relationships and that collaboration with the national teams. But we increased that collaboration with the USA just to ensure that we weren't duplicating areas that they were already treating, or that we divvied up essentially the support that we were giving. As I mentioned before, we developed pragmatic M&E tools, methods to address the questions, to be able to verify, because we literally, if you didn't get a suitably high score from DFID, our funding could literally be cut, so which obviously would be disastrous for countries. And I think the mHealth tools that are in use now, the survey tools as well, we developed an mHealth tool for mapping lymphedema and hydrocele, which was low cost, could be done by community workers in the field. That is then owned by the country. And I guess what has started to come through towards the end of the programme, new funding agencies coming through, so that there's more attention and focus on NTDs. We also trialled, LSTM trialled a new rapid diagnostic test in Malawi, and that was more reliable, didn't need a cold chain, so at least there was the tools that were available to programme teams. And also we became quite adept and expert at things like customs clearances and also national distribution supply chain in terms of the support we could give to countries. So just to recap really, in terms of in the countries we had, the only countries that did achieve elimination during the period of the programme was Malawi, and their programme was the textbook linear programme where they did 5 MDAs and they went straight into transmission surveys. But we did have some real successes in terms of DRC, where we got to full geographical coverage of treatment across 425 zones. There was only the area, the Kivus, which are not under government control, that we were not able to support treatment in. Across the board, there were real successes. Nearly 46,000 hydrocele surgeries carried out in actually a period of 2017. So I think what was achieved was enormous. I would just say these are some of the statements that DFID wrote themselves. This is in their report. But the programme supported 335.7 million treatments. And at least we got to a point where we all agreed what a treatment was. And so I think it was the huge achievement. But I would say, as we got to Ascend, and you'll know from the timings, Ascend started at the end of 2019. So at that point, we obviously hit COVID as well. And I think that's the point at which I showed the different map, where there was a significant and, in my opinion, a seismic shift in the way that NTD programmes were supported. And obviously they had a year when COVID was problematic for them, but we have found that since the programme has ended, the programme ended because FCDO cut the funding in 2021, obviously due to the UK aid funding gaps that they had. But these are some of the questions that have come through in 2023, which for me are particularly distressing, because the countries have actually been left with little support and likely to roll back some of those gains they made.
So it falls to me to introduce our final speaker, our chair for today, Mark Taylor. Mark's the Professor of Parasitology here at LSTM. He is the Director of the Centre for Neglected Tropical Diseases, and he's going to talk to us about some of his work to implement new cures for river blindness.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Sian. Just to go back to Sian's, the glass is half empty then. What she didn't tell you is that the CNTD eliminated lymphatic filariasis from Malawi and Bangladesh. There aren't many people in the School of Tropical Medicine that can make that claim, so congratulations. Okay, so I'm going to keep on the theme of parasitic nematodes and move from lymphatic filariasis to onchocerciasis or river blindness, and take you through what we've been doing to try and implement a new cure that we discovered about 25 years ago. Onchocerciasis, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is a chronic disease which is common around many riverine systems in Africa and is associated with both skin disease and blindness. There are nearly 15 million people that require treatment. 21 million are already infected, have skin disease, and more than 1 million have vision loss. The amber and red colouring in the map of sub-Saharan Africa shows you where it's endemic. There are a few small foci in South America, in the Amazonia, in Brazil and Venezuela, but they've largely been eliminated from South America. But the main burden of disease, of course, remains in Africa. So the target of the curative therapy that I discovered about 25 years ago is this Wolbachia bacterial endosymbiont. And we found out that the worm has become dependent upon this bacteria for its development, growth, and survival. We've heard from Grant Hughes about how Wolbachia in insects and mosquitoes is being used as a public health tool against arboviruses, and has had already impressive impacts against reducing the incidence of dengue. But in filariasis, the bacteria have gone down a different evolutionary path and have become mutualists for which the worm are entirely dependent upon. And we think that Wolbachia contributes three main biosynthetic pathways. So the pathways for purines and pyrimidines, the building blocks of nucleic acids, heme, riboflavin, and FAD, they're intact in the bacteria but missing from the parasitic worm. So these are the metabolic pathways which support growth and development of filarial nematodes at the times of greatest metabolic demand. We also showed that they're responsible for driving some of the disease pathogenesis. So when the microfilariae die, the Wolbachia are released into tissues. And in the case of the cornea, this then attracts inflammatory neutrophils from the blood into the cornea. This leads to further activation of the neutrophils, their degranulation, and the resultant visual impairment. So the bacteria appear to be essential for the development, larval development and embryogenesis. They're also essential for transmission through the insect vector. They contribute to disease pathogenesis, but most importantly, from the therapeutic point of view, is that they're responsible for the longevity of filarial nematodes. So if you deplete Wolbachia from a filarial nematode, instead of living for a decade or more, it will die after 1 or 2 years. So we've done a whole range of clinical trials using doxycycline, and we've done a regimen reduction approach, trying to find what the minimum course of treatment is that's required to eliminate the bacteria. And this is between 4 and 6 weeks for onchocerciasis. We've recently done a very large implementation trial with our colleagues in Cameroon, including Dr. Peter Enyong and Professor Sami Wanji, who are joining us at the meeting today. And this is where the community were responsible for delivering a 5-week course of doxycycline. And we were lucky enough that these brave folk went into a conflict zone to try and measure the impact of this alternative community implementation strategy. And it was excellent news. We already knew that it would reduce the skin burden of microphilodermia by nearly 70%. But the most exciting outcome was that you can palpate the nodules in onchocerca patients. You can see on the left-hand panel the nodules just beneath the skin. And from baseline, about 24% of the patients had palpable nodules. And then when they were followed up 30 months later, only 2 patients had nodules. And those 2 patients had acquired those nodules after the treatment. So that's a new acquisition. So it's essentially a complete curative therapy. One more recently recognized condition in onchocerciasis is something called onchocerciasis-associated epilepsy, which has been epidemiologically linked to where there's very high transmission of onchocerciasis. It's characterized, it affects children and adolescents, and it's characterized by 2 syndromes. One is the nodding syndrome, which you can see here. A child from Uganda has got this nodding behavior. And also you see typical epileptic seizures, which results in children falling into fires and falling into water. So there's a high fatality rate with this syndrome. And there's the Nakalanga syndrome, which is a developmental or impact on the growth and development of children. And you can see here, if you look at the 3 individuals from DRC on the left-hand side, you've got an uninfected 17-year-old, on the right an uninfected 8-year-old, but the child in the middle is 20 years old. So you can see what the impact of this developmental problems are. And you see scoliosis and you see blindness in these children as well. Together with Dr. Richard Idro from Uganda, we tested a course of doxycycline in patients suffering from nodding syndrome. And the excellent news is that this decreased acute seizure-related hospitalisation, decreased deaths related to nodding syndrome, and reduced the antibodies which some people think contribute to the disease pathogenesis. We have a poster session downstairs, and I would encourage you to look at a poster by Dr. Shannon Queck, who is a very talented postdoc in my lab. And Shannon has recently discovered, he's a bioinformatician, he's recently discovered 91 novel RNA viruses which infect 70% of parasitic nematodes. And so this is going to revolutionize, we think, our understanding of nematode biology and disease. But I just particularly want to mention that one of these viruses is a rhabdovirus, which is linked to viruses such as rabies, which are neurotropic viruses. And we think this rhabdovirus in onchocerciasis might be one of the candidates that drives this onchocerciasis-associated epilepsy. So, as I said, it's related to the lysoviruses, including rabies. And so we think that that's a candidate and is something that we're going to be looking at in the next few years. So the AWOL program was started in 2007, and the problem with doxycycline is you have to give a course for several weeks, and so we were charged by the Gates Foundation to come up with a shorter regimen of 7 days or less, which could be used in children and women of childbearing age. And after 10 years of drug discovery and development, we came up with, after screening nearly 2 million compounds, we had 20,000 hits, which included both registered drugs and new designer drugs. Unfortunately, we visited the Valley of Death with both our lead and backup candidate, and so we are having to go back to so one of them was AWZ 1066, and that failed at phase 1 because of unforeseen safety issues. But if we don't use it as an oral treatment, but use it as an injectable, Joe Turner and his team, and there's another poster from Jess Dagley downstairs, which I encourage you to look at, just 2 shots of AWZ 1023 given to dogs completely prevents heartworm. So it's a remarkably effective treatment and one that we could use as an injectable. So now we're going back to our AstraZeneca hits, which included 9 clusters of fast-acting drugs, which we think can give us this shorter regimen for an anti-Wolbachia treatment. So I'm going to finish by thanking the members of the AWOL consortium, many of which are still with us in LSTM. We have Jeremy Burrows here as well, and I'd like to make a special mention to Jeremy for his contribution to the AWOL programme with his advice and vast expertise that he has at his day job, which is working with MMV. So thank you, Jeremy, for your contributions. And thank you, everyone.